As we emerge on the other side of the resurrection, now that Easter Sunday is past, we've been reading through the Gospel of John as a church. We've been utilizing the books of the Bible to read through the New Testament. And as we've reached the latter half of the Gospel of John together, there are a couple of things that I've noticed that I really would love to share with you today. The first one is this, that as Jesus is beginning to talk about how he's headed towards the cross, suffering, death, and then eventually and ultimately his resurrection, the disciples become increasingly anxious, troubled in heart, fearful. And then the second thing I'd like to bring to your attention is that each and every time that the disciples become anxious and troubled in heart and overwhelmed, Jesus does not ignore their need, but rather Jesus speaks right into the center of their emotional and spiritual struggle. What I want you to notice today is what Jesus speaks into the life of his disciples and what he speaks into our lives as well as we read the gospel. As he predicts his suffering, his death, and his resurrection, and following the resurrection, Jesus speaks the very same message, the very same words that the disciples so desperately need to hear, and that we desperately need to hear as well. We read in the latter half of chapter 13, Jesus is sharing with his disciples that he's going to a place that they cannot follow at the present moment. They can't follow him. They will follow him later, Jesus says, but not at this moment. And Peter, in a frantic way, kind of says, "Why can't I follow you now, Jesus? I'll lay my very life down for you." Of course, we know Peter will not lay his life down for Jesus. Neither will any of the other disciples. In fact, Peter will deny Jesus 3 times. But here's the thing. Jesus knows their deep struggle, and he speaks directly into it. He speaks to them in a number of ways and places, but one passage that we're very familiar with is in John chapter 14, where Jesus says to his disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." And he tells them, of course, that he'll prepare a place for them and come back and take them to be with him where he is. And Jesus continues on, and he says so much more. In fact, we come to the end of chapter 14, and Jesus tells them how he will be with them in a different way in the future through the Holy Spirit. He won't abandon them. And we read these very words of Jesus to his disciples. "All this I have spoken while still with you. But the Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything that I've said to you. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. My peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you." Jesus continues and says even more than this, speaking of similar things in chapter 16, when he says to his disciples, "I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you'll have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Now we move to the moment after the resurrection, the moments that ensue as the disciples discover Jesus' body is not in the tomb. And Mary Magdalene, of course, runs back and tells all the disciples. And you would think that after hearing this news that the disciples would be free of their fears and anxieties. They would be overjoyed instead of overwhelmed. But instead we find them huddled behind locked doors for fear of the Jews, the scriptures tell us. And notice this, on 2 occasions, Jesus comes right into their midst, behind those locked doors. The first time is on the very night of the resurrection. Jesus comes behind the locked doors that they're huddled behind, and he comes and stands among them and speaks these words, "Peace be with you." And then before leaving them, he says this again. He says, to just reinforce it, "Peace be with you." But he adds on to that, "As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." And with that, He breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." 1 week later, Jesus comes again into that very same room. You would think that by now maybe they had moved beyond their fear and anxiety, but no, the doors are still locked. They're still in the same position. And this time Jesus comes because he wants to prove his resurrection to Thomas. We call him Doubting Thomas because of that. And Jesus comes into the center of that room, and once again, Jesus will speak these words. He will speak peace into their lives when he says, "Peace be with you." And maybe you can understand, and maybe you can relate today to the disciples. You experience the high victory that we celebrate on an Easter Sunday like we just did. We proclaim it, we celebrate it, but how quickly that victory and that high can dissipate when we walk into the trouble of our Mondays and our Tuesdays and our Wednesdays. But I'm so glad that God's stubborn and persistent love pursues us and seeks to speak into our lives, "Peace be with you, peace be in you." No matter what we might face or no matter how we may feel, Jesus comes and speaks those words into our lives. And not only peace for our own sakes, but peace for our troubled world's sake as well. Jesus speaks peace and says, "As the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you." So today, church, may you hear Jesus speaking peace into your life. May you walk in his peace today. And may you carry and bear his peace with you as he sends you out into a troubled and anxious world today that so desperately needs to hear Jesus say to them once again, "Peace be with you."